the proximity is crazy. So on the one hand, I want to ask, I'm very curious, what is it like to have someone like Maurice Bishop call on you to say basically come home and lead
Right.
this revolution? And then similarly on the flip side of that, unfortunately, you were also, as I've heard the story a few times, very close at the point of his assassination. And I'm
Yes.
wondering if you would want to share anything about sort of
Mhm.
those two bookend moments of
Right.
your relationship.
Yes, of course, with pleasure. I had known Maurice Bishop from a long time ago when we were teenagers, and we went to the same boys' secondary school in Grenada. We're talking about now in the 1960s. Um, and our fathers were good friends. They were bridge players together. Maurice's father, Rupert Bishop, and my father, Frank Rojas. Um, Bishop and I were on the tennis team. We were on the debate team. He was a few years older than me, but I always looked up to him because he was kind of the student leader without exception. Everyone deferred to him as the student leader back in those days because of his activism in organizing the students at that secondary school into study groups and into ways of understanding our British colonial experience back in those days. So here's a person that I had known for many years. In the mid 1960s, he went off to England to study law, became a practitioner of a people's law operation, law practice, in which he helped pro bono in many cases um, Caribbean immigrants in London to organize themselves in protecting their rights uh, as um, as immigrant workers in England during those days in the 60s. He went to England and I migrated to the United States in 1968. We lost contact with each other for a number of years. And then comes fast forward to 1979. As I said before, we met in New York, had a conversation. He invited me to come back to Grenada, and I accepted it. And there I was. I found myself in the middle of the construction of a people's revolution, a popular democratic participatory process led by Bishop and the New Jewel movement. Became very involved in not only in the professional life of a revolutionary journalist, but also as a member of the New Jewel movement, by both myself and my wife. Earlier on, Herb talked about Michelle Gibbs. Michelle Gibbs, a friend of his, who also became a friend of mine. I met Michelle while I was editing the Amsterdam News in Grenada. Michelle offered, she was herself a writer and a journalist. She offered her services um, as a volunteer at the Free West Indian. She helped do research. She helped with some editing. She helped do some writing and reporting. She was a stalwart, brilliant sister, an African American sister. Um, and I must say, during the time of the revolution, we had a lot of African American activists visited the country, and including people like Angela Davis, Harry Belafonte, and many others came to Grenada to witness for themselves what was taking place, what's going on with this, what Fidel Castro called a big revolution in a small country. This tiny uh, tropical paradise in the Eastern Caribbean had made a revolution that had actually shaken up the entire region and resonated across the world. So to answer your question, Jared, that's how we
Yeah.
came together. Yeah.
And then, but you were also there at the unfortunate end. Is also, I was hoping you could share a
Yes,
little
I
bit
was at
about
it
that too. Yeah.
unfortunate, and yes, and I was, thanks to Maurice, my life was saved because I was with him, physically with him, at the Fort Rupert after the masses of Grenadians, led by school children, marched to his home where he was under house arrest, released him, took him to the fort where he would be rest and prepared to speak to the Grenadian masses at a rally in the market square later that day. I spoke with him briefly at the fort, and he said to me, "Why don't you go to the telephone company and try to make some calls to the outside world and let them know what was going on in Grenada on that fateful day of October 19th, that the people had freedom and that he was preparing to address the crowd." Uh, while I was uh, making those phone calls, I could hear and see from my vantage point machine gun fire coming from the fort. I could see people jumping off the high walls of this was an old fort that was constructed by the British colonial slave masters back in the 18th and 19th centuries. And I could hear the gunfire. I could see people jumping off the fort to their death. Uh, and I was able to actually report what I saw in real time, speaking to the Caribbean News Agency in Barbados and to the Reuters news agency. And once those agencies put the words out on their wire that uh, all hell had broken loose in Grenada, I did not know that Bishop was assassinated at that time, and I was making these phone calls. I found out a few hours later that he and Jacqueline Kraft, a number of other members of his cabinet, other leaders of the Mutual Movement, labor leaders, civil society leaders were all assassinated on that day. And I found that out. I immediately went into hiding until the U.S. invaded Grenada on October the 25th. And I was able to get out of Grenada. The U.S. Military, uh, after interrogating me with M16s at my forehead, interrogating me, decided that they could not get anything out of me. They asked me all kinds of questions about where the military forces were, where the Cuban forces were, blah blah blah. I said I didn't know. While I was being interrogated, here comes the first plane load of journalists from Barbados who had been marooned by the U.S. military in Barbados, refused to let any Caribbean or international journalists into the country to report on the invasion. Finally, under tremendous international pressure, they allowed the first plane load of, I think it was about 11 journalists from the Caribbean region and from the United States were brought in, kept under guard. They could not move from the site of the international airport that was being constructed with Cuban assistance. They could not report on the fighting. They were just allowed a few minutes, literally about half hour at the most, on the island. But while they were there, many of them saw me. Many of them knew who I was, and they came over to where I was being interrogated and demanded to be interviewed, demanded to interview me. The uh, the CIA at the time they were sort of giving guidance to the U.S. military as to what to do and who to do, who to hold, who to police, etc., etc. They they told the journalist said to the CIA, "We know this man. We know Don Rojas. We know him well. We know him uh, from from the U.S., from his work in the U.S., etc. So we are demanding that we speak with him." And one of the very first questions was, "What's your view of this U.S. invasion? Do you support it?" I said, "No, I do not support it as a matter of principle. I do not support the foreign military aggression and the interference in the domestic affairs of any country, including, of course, my beloved Grenada." And so I guess they figured, well, this man is of no use to me. No use to us. So they put me on an A-30 transport plane, a U.S. military transport plane, and sent me to Barbados and just dropped me off in Barbados with just a clothes on my back and you know, separated from my family, etc. It's a long, long story, but anyway, that the fact that Maurice sent me to make these calls is what actually saved my life. And that day, October the 19th, 1983.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.